You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and I read the Bible, talk about it, try to figure it out, and see where things go. Really, we don't know what's going on here.
I have no clue. It's been one of those weeks, but it's. I think we've both been exhausted. We've had long weeks. I've been planting flowers in my yard, so I feel like I've been beat. And because I live in Cherokee County, where there's like a layer of rock, and then there's another layer of rock on top of a layer of rock. So yeah. So I don't just spend all my time reading books. Sometimes I have to do some manual labor.
Yeah, and we're getting toward the end of the year up at the school, and anyone who works at a school knows what the end of the year looks like.
Yeah.
So
things I don't miss about teaching.
Yeah, and I'm not even a teacher. I'm doing the maintenance side of things. So it gets a little crazy. I mean, I still love working there. It's a good place, but yeah, it's just this time of year. Yeah, everyone knows that's just part of the game. It's just what happens. So, but yeah, that's not why everyone's here. We're here to talk about, what are we here to talk about? The Bible.
Yeah, 2 Samuel 19. We're picking up in verse 24. And we have, Absalom's been killed. David's been told he needs to straighten up and quit pouting. And he has started his journey back to Jerusalem. And he's been doing kind of this backwards journey that mirrors his flight, because in the flight he met 3 people. And on his return, he's meeting 3 people who are connected. And there's some parallelisms going on here. And last week we talked about Shimei, the Benjaminite who cursed David, who threw rocks at him, and David had forgiven him. And we cut it off right before he encountered Mephibosheth. Now, this parallels where David runs into Ziva on his flight. And so we're going to get into why that's important. And we're also going to see something the writer did that was kind of interesting, because this is a really good passage to show how the writer has arranged events to make a point. And so you can definitely see some editing going on, that this is not a faithful blow-by-blow historical, linear, or chronological account. This has been put together to teach a theological lesson. And so I find that interesting, because so often when people read their Bibles, they want to say, oh, well, this is how it has it, so it has to be exactly this way. But if you pay attention to those little clues, you can see that sometimes the events have been, I hate to use the word manipulated, because that kind of has a negative connotation, but
maybe go arranged.
Arranged, yeah. Well, and you know what?
Curated.
Well, and let's be honest, when the chiropractor manipulates my back, that's a good thing. So manipulation isn't always bad. It's just, what are your motives? So anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. So we'll pick up in verse 24, and then we'll get into talking about what's so crazy with all this. So it says, and Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. Now, if we think back to before all of this, I mean, even before Bathsheba and Uriah and all of that, we're going to find 2 stories. And one is David seeking out one of Jonathan's sons to show kindness to show hesed to. And then the story of Hanun, the king of the Amorites, who David had showed compassion to, and he wanted to send comforters to, because Hanun's father had died. And if you remember, Hanun's father's name was Nakash. And so we talked about, when we looked at those stories, how this was David's misplaced compassion. And there was a problem with what was going on, because first of all, why do you comfort Hanun, the king of the Amorites, son of Nakash? And if you remember your Hebrew, Nakash is the same word as the word for the serpent in the garden. So the writer's telling us
Mhm.
something about his characteristics. And then Mephibosheth, whenever he finds him, he invites Mephibosheth to come eat at his table, which on the surface sounds like a really great idea. But the question that we have to ask, is this really kindness, or is this some kind of dressed up house arrest where David can keep tabs on Mephibosheth and make sure that this threat, who, I mean, we've got to be honest, Mephibosheth, as a grandson of Saul, as the king that some still believed was the rightful king of Israel, not David, we saw that with Shimei, Mephibosheth is a threat to David's reign. And so by keeping him in his home where he can keep tabs, we can we can kind of see where David might be being a little smart with how he dispenses his compassion. And the story with Hanun really was the kickoff for the Bathsheba and Uriah events, because that's what determined that they were going to go and battle against Hanun. This is why Joab was out fighting for the city of Rabbah. That's where Hanun ruled. And so
Mhm.
Hanun's king of Rabbah, Joab's out fighting. David's at home walking the rooftops when he sees Bathsheba. And so that sets everything else into motion. So we've kind of come full circle here, and we're seeing the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy about David from the events of Bathsheba and Uriah. And so we see this second encounter with Mephibosheth, and we kind of want to have some anticipation. What's going to happen now? Because if you remember back to when David was fleeing from Jerusalem and he meets Ziva, Ziva had said that Mephibosheth was plotting to take David's throne. So there's a lot of stuff we got to keep in mind as we look at the story to keep all the background, because a lot of stuff has happened between these events.
Mhm.
So in 2 Samuel 9, and we're just going to real quick recap 2 Samuel 9, where we meet Mephibosheth and we meet Ziva. This is when Ziva had commended Mephibosheth to David, and he had soothed away any David's fears. You know, he's a cripple, he can't really do anything, he's not really a threat, you have no worries, no reason to worry about him. And then when we get to 2 Samuel 16, Ziva has completely reversed his position and said, you know, hey, he's trying to take your crown. He's waiting in Jerusalem, just, you know, hoping to get an opportunity. And Ziva says, I've abandoned him because um, I'm loyal to you, where he had previously claimed, I'm keeping tabs of Mephibosheth because I was loyal to Saul's house, you know, pretty much was what he
Mhm.
had presented it. So up to this point, the writer has really left Ziva as kind of this ambiguous character. Is he telling the truth? When was he telling the truth? How much of the truth is he withholding? And so we don't know what to think. And then all of a sudden we have Mephibosheth who shows up. Now you have to remember Ziva is here. Ziva has already joined this entourage that David has following him back to Jerusalem, because Ziva had come along with Shimei. Now Ziva hadn't spoken, but the writer made sure to tell you Ziva is with him along with 1,000 other Benjaminites. And
Mm.
so everything is playing out in front of Ziva, who has accused Mephibosheth, and now Mephibosheth shows up, and he's in a state of public grieving. He's not washed his feet or trimmed his toenails. He hasn't cared for his beard. He hasn't trimmed it. He hasn't oiled it. And remember, the beards were a source of pride for men in this
Mhm.
culture.
Mhm.
He's not washed his clothes, and he hasn't done this since the day David left. Now, I tried to find some kind of timetable for how long this had been, and some sources claim that it was as little as a month. Others say that it was as long as a year. So,
Right.
but it's evidently been long enough that you can tell he hasn't trimmed his toenails. So,
Right. Well, I mean, and there, knowing that his feet have been maimed, there's probably also other things he would need to take care of
Mhm.
with that. But it's definitely not the actions of someone who's trying to portray themselves as royalty.
Exactly. And actually, this is like the most resistance that a crippled man in Jerusalem can offer, because he's not, you know, trying to fight Absalom, but he's basically, by his appearance, making this public statement that he's not going to quietly accept Absalom's reign. So he's actually put himself in a position of danger just by doing this, by publicly mourning the fact that David is gone. And so,
Hmm.
this guy's got some real guts and courage about him. And, when he shows up and he's been grieving in this public way, a way that can't be faked. I mean, you can't, just instantaneously make your toenails grow out to make a good appearance in front of the king. He's making sure that everyone can see exactly the depth of his grief. And you kind of have to admire him a bit when you realize what he was risking by doing this. Now, the problem is whenever he does this, he's really creating some issues for David, but we're going to get there. Verse 25, when Mephibosheth came to Jerusalem to meet the king says to him, "Why did you not go out with me, Mephibosheth?" So automatically we have a reversal here because remember in the beginning of the story, back in 9, when we first met Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth had to be brought to Jerusalem. Now
Hmm.
David is being brought to Jerusalem. So we have a reversal of roles there. And David's response is it's weird because Mephibosheth's crippled. And David's, chastising him for not going with him. And we already know that the journey was very difficult for those people who were with David that had been described in the previous chapters. And when Hushai had shown up and said, "Hey, I want to go with you," what did David said? "You're too old. You're going to be a burden to me. Go back home. Don't think that you're going to help me out by staying with me. Just go back to Jerusalem." So then David is asking this crippled guy, "Why didn't you join me?" It's a strange question unless he thinks there's some validity to Ziva's charges, or he's offering Mephibosheth an invitation to defend himself, which I think that's how Mephibosheth hears it. Because
Hmm.
if you notice verses 26 through 28, he answered, again, Mephibosheth speaking, "My lord, my king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself that I may ride on it and go out with the king, for your servant is lame. And he slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like an angel of God. Do what seems good to you. For all of your father's house were men doomed, for all of my father's house were men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I than to cry to the king?" So, Mephibosheth is proclaiming his loyalty to David in the strongest terms. He
Hmm.
he he wants there to be no doubt that, the only reason he wasn't there was because he was crippled. He needed that donkey. Ziva had deceived him. He'd taken the donkey instead. He had left Mephibosheth stranded. And so he owes David everything, and he trusts David with everything. And, it's really funny that the rabbis actually try to justify what Ziva did. And they said, Mephibosheth could have gotten a donkey someplace else. And, maybe, but if he had, gone to the neighbor and said, "Hey, let me have your donkey so I can join David," and the neighbor had stayed behind, now the neighbor is in a precarious situation.
Well, there's that, and also we've worked with animals, donkeys included,
Right?
and animals. I mean, and donkeys are really smart. People don't give them a lot of credit.
Hmm.
They kind of are. I don't know why people think of them as like stupid animals, but
It's because they
they
outsmart their owners.
well, that's probably true. But they're pretty smart, and especially if you have one like we don't know. I mean, the interpretation says that he's lame in his feet.
Hmm.
He could have a donkey that's more docile, who's
Hmm.
he's been with for years. I mean, animals are like
Yeah.
that. There are certain horses and donkeys and mules that will only let one person ride them, and and if he needed any kind of special accommodations because maybe he couldn't put his feet into stirrups,
Hmm.
I mean, there's plenty of
Trying to think if stirrups had
uh
been invented at that point, but
well,
yeah.
yeah, I don't know if they would, but I mean, apparently that is one of the uh, most world-changing inventions
Hmm.
is actually stirrups. But that being said, yeah, I don't know if they would have been invented, but I'm just trying to think of like or anyone like we use use seeing eye
Mhm.
dogs, or for people who are blind, people who have special accommodations, we train animals to help
Right.
them in certain ways. So it's possible that this donkey would, be specific to what Mephibosheth needed.
I
So that's what I'm thinking of there when you bring that out.
Well, that's very much a possibility, and I like you said, since we have worked with animals, that's something we've seen. Matter of fact, it was funny for a while, we had a 2 horses, and I could work with one, and my daughter, who's really great with horses, could work with the other, but we couldn't switch. And,
Yeah.
and we could, but it was a lot more work, but yeah. Anyway, and when you are somebody who's not steady on your feet, working with an unfamiliar animal brings its own level of risk and endangerment. So, but
Yeah, and donkeys, they're not typically as large as horses,
mhm.
um, but they're still large enough animals, and they are smart enough animals. They can cause you some damage.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, I mean, I know it's common in Oklahoma for people to keep donkeys out with their cows because donkeys, they don't look it, but they're feisty and they will fight off coyotes.
Exactly, exactly.
So that's something to they're a little more wily than people
Right, and and these are things
credit them for.
well, and these are things you've gotta take into consideration with the stories, because if you haven't grown up in that environment and you haven't worked in these kinds of situations, then you may not be familiar, might just think, "Oh, well, it's just a matter of going out and getting on some kind of animal to ride." Well, there's a lot more to it, and
Mhm,
so but the problem with what Mephibosheth says is now David's in a really bad situation because Ziva had joined David in the flight from Absalom. He had joined David in fighting against Absalom. And it wasn't just Ziva, it was Ziva, his 15 sons, it was his 20 servants. Whenever they were
mhm,
hungry on the journey, Ziva had brought donkeys and bread and raisins and different fruits and wine. And, David's survival really was helped, at least by Ziva, in very
mhm.
practical, tangible ways, while Mephibosheth is at home not cutting his toenails. So, when you see the disparity there of what's happening, now David has a hard decision to make because, the only thing Mephibosheth can do is say, "Hey, I'm loyal to you. I trust you. I'm at your mercy." And he
Mhm,
could offer this symbolic resistance, but he couldn't offer any kind of real resistance. And so, what's David going to do? Because we already saw that his hold over the army is precarious. We saw that with Joab. Whenever Joab said, "Hey, if you don't get it together, I'm taking the army and we're done." And
mhm,
35 fighting men, actually 36 when you include Ziva himself, 36 fighting men was a considerable portion of that army. And so David has to figure out, what is he going to do? Is he the politician? Is he the king who's going to play politics and play favorites and bring back the person who can offer him the most tangible and practical good? Or is he going
mhm.
to be someone who's compassionate on a crippled man who has nothing to offer? So, verse 29, and the king said to him, "Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziva shall divide the land." Now, basically what David's saying is here, why are you still talking? Just shut up.
Yeah, I've spoken. We're done.
Yeah, I don't wanna hear any more about it, whatever, we're moving on. And, he couldn't really punish Siva because that would upset the power balance, but he doesn't take a stand, and he doesn't offer justice to Mephibosheth, and he doesn't enact justice on Ziva, and he dodges the issue by dividing the land instead of saying, "One of you messed up and one of you did right." Lying to the king was a punishable offense and
Right.
punishable by death. And so even though Ziva, quote, lied for the right reason, he had maligned someone that David had promised to take care of.
Mhm,
And, once again, if we have any compassion and we aren't just looking at practicalities, we should be disappointed with our hero because he's showing us that his compassion is still misplaced. Just like where we started with the story with Mephibosheth and Hanun, he still doesn't get it right. He's decided to be the politician and not the friend. And so he basically just eschews justice in favor of what's expedient and comfortable. just like he did before with Mephibosheth, just with Hanun, with Bathsheba, with Uriah, Amnon, Absalom. And so that circle has been traveled, and we don't see a great change because every time David starts to think of himself as the king, he does stupid stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
he isn't the David we love. And so this pronouncement is so problematic that the Gemara, which is basically a commentary on the Bible, and it has a lot of the extraneous stories, sees this as the point in time where the kingdom is going to be divided. This is what sets it off. And so it says, the Gemara says that as soon as David says these words, that the divine voice, the Bat Kol, the daughter voice of heaven, came out of the heavens and said, Rehoboam and Jeroboam will divide the kingship. So they specifically credit the divided kingdom, which was going to end up with Israel falling into idolatry. It's going to end up with Israel being in exile. It's going to cause all of these problems. It happens because, in their minds, David divided the land between Mephibosheth and Ziba.
Hmm.
And I thought that was very interesting. And so Rabbi Yehuda claimed that had David not divided the fields, Israel never would have been divided. And they wouldn't have worshipped idols. They wouldn't have gone into exile. And all of the major horrible events that Israel is going to experience actually could have been prevented if David would have had integrity and compassion in the right way in this moment. Now, Rashi actually believes that David understood this, and I thought this was interesting. He claims that in Psalms 116:11, when the psalmist, this psalm isn't specifically credited to David, but if you believe he wrote it, the psalmist says, all men are liars. And so Rashi says that this is David lamenting the fact that Ziba lied to him and kind of forced his hand to make that decision. And the writer wants you to see how problematic this is. This is what I was talking about, where we see that editing and the arrangement, the curation of the passages, as you said, because he has deliberately juxtaposed David's treatment of Mephibosheth against how David had previously dealt with Shimei. Because Shimei had cursed David, he had thrown rocks at David, and done things that he should have under the law been executed for. And David had said, no, I forgive him. We're good. It's all good. And then with Mephibosheth, who stayed at home, risked his life under Absalom's reign in Jerusalem, David takes half of his possessions away. And so this is why the stories are put together. And I'm going to show you how we know that the stories were rearranged in a few verses. But verse 30, and Mephibosheth said to the king, oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. So Mephibosheth is completely his father's son. Remember, Jonathan was Mephibosheth's dad. And what had Jonathan done with David? He'd given him the coat. He said, take my armor, take my weapons, take my place as king, pretty much is what he said. And he's like, I don't want it. And so we see that Mephibosheth really has no aspirations for himself. He is unwaveringly loyal to David. And, on the surface, if you just read this story and you pull this little section out, it seems that, this isn't an unreasonable thing. I mean, Ziba had, helped David, and there's some wisdom to it. And some people have even claimed that, this is kind of a precursor to Solomon's decision of dividing the baby. And, you can kind of see that a little bit. But, what I saw as I read through it is how well the writer sets us up. Because the writer wants us to identify with Mephibosheth. I mean, because if you can see, reason and rationalization and some kind of justification for David's decision, then you're thinking like David. You're thinking like David, the politician. And we've lost the plot because that's not the mission of the Messiah. The Messiah is not supposed to reward those who have something to offer him in return. And we know who the Messiah is supposed to be. He's supposed to break the bows of the mighty. He's supposed to bind strength onto the feeble. He's supposed to feed the hungry, raise up the poor, lift the needy from the ash heap so that he could sit with princes. And why? Because God exalts the horn of his anointed, of his Messiah. And that was, some of what Hannah had prophesied that the Messiah should be. We know what the Messiah looks like because this is the expectation that Hannah had set for us way back there in 1 Samuel. And this is the reason why when we look at David, even if the decisions he makes are politically correct or politically expedient, if they do not measure up to the standard of what the Messiah should be given by Hannah, he's not being who he's supposed to be. Because the hope of Israel was in the Messiah. This is what turns everything around from that period of Judges where everything was so terrible, is the coming Messiah. And so David, when he fails to embody that person, we realize that our expectation has to be set in the future. That it can't be waiting, we can't be looking at a human person to fulfill this role. And, the book of Samuel is not meant to comfort us. And it's not supposed to give us this perfect human king who could embody the hopes and the purposes of God. It's to show us that even the most admirable and the the best king that Israel ever had still fell short of what God intended. So we've got to reject the temptation to read these stories with an agenda where David is this great hero who can do no wrong. We have to look at him and go, he is flawed. He is making mistakes. He is failing on so many counts, but there's one who is better. So
Mhm.
if he can get this close, as flawed as he is, and he can be celebrated as flawed as he is, then how much more can we celebrate the true Messiah, the ultimate Messiah? And, if we want to identify with anybody in this story, it's not the king. We need to take ourselves out of that position because, there's that tendency when you read a Bible story, when you look at the hero, even the flawed heroes, you want to be that person.
Mhm.
We're supposed to see ourselves as Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is the ideal that we should be trying to aspire to. The one who says, "Hey, even if you take it all, even if, I get nothing out of this, you're my Lord, you're my king, and I'm not going to betray you because all
Right.
that matters is you are the Lord and King, and I'm nobody." What right? I mean, remember back at the beginning when we met Mephibosheth, he even says, why are you even bothering with me, a dead dog?"
Mhm.
So this is this is the cool thing about this story is the writer wants you to see that there should be more, and that he's also showing us that what Jesus is going to teach us about the first being last, and about the reversals that go on there. Why? Because that's what Hannah has taught us back in her song. The
Mhm.
Messiah is all about reversals and all about subverting societal and cultural expectations and elevating those that people have discounted. So, verse 31. Now Barzillai the Gileadite had come down from Regalim, and he went on with the king to Jordan to escort him over the Jordan. Now, this is the verse that shows you that juxtaposition of Mephibosheth and Shimei being deliberate, because Mephibosheth met David as he was going into Jerusalem. Barzillai is meeting David before he crosses over the Jordan. He's still some distance away. So the writer chose to delay telling us about Barzillai so he could tell us about Mephibosheth first. This is the
Mm.
reason why we know we're supposed to make those comparisons. So Barzillai escorts David back to Jerusalem. And, back in chapter 17, this is when we first met Barzillai. He was also somebody who showed up with, food and comfort items for David's, troops and the families that traveled with him. He's a great guy. We like him because he seems to be giving with no expectation, and
Mhm.
he seems to be very humble, and we're gonna read more about this, find out more as we read through. So, verse 32, Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. He provided the king with food while he stayed at Manaim. Sorry, that's one of those words that always throws me. For he was a wealthy man. So we need these details to explain what Barzillai and David are going to do next. Again, so 80 years old, that's pretty old in that day and age.
In that day, yeah, that was,
Yeah,
almost no one made it that far.
exactly. And he provided for David lavishly when David was on the run. He's a wealthy man. The Hebrew actually says he is a great man. And the translators have decided to translate this in a way that reflects his financial situation, which might be a little bit of a cultural thing on the translator's part. It's very true. Wealthy men are often great men in their society and culture because they have the resources and funds to do great things. So,
Mhm.
but it could also refer to his moral integrity and his character, not just his financial status. And so the fact that the two are not separated might actually have something to do with them coexisting within one person. Just a thought. So when you don't have those distinctions, sometimes it's supposed to encompass more. So,
Mhm.
verse 33, and the king says to Barzillai, come over with me and I will provide for you with me in Jerusalem. So we talked about when we first met Barzillai that it's possible that he was he made arms, he made weapons that he
He was an armorer?
Thank you. Yes, and so from that sense, it really does make sense that David keeps him close because he is, he could provide David with weapons and armor for his army, but it also meant that Barzillai would be less likely to, sell arms and weapons to David's competition. And we have to remember being David's house guest, because this is the other distinction, contrast and comparison we're supposed to make, is Barzillai and Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was David's house guest, and we talked about just recently that the keeping Mephibosheth in his house was one way to keep Mephibosheth close. So David could be doing the same thing with Barzillai. Now, but notice what Barzillai does. Verse 34. But Barzillai said to the king, how many years have I still to live that I should go with the king to Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old. Can I discern what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats or what he drinks? Can I still listen to the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? So there's two ways to read this. One is face value. This is what this guy actually means. Hey, I'm old. I'm not going to enjoy anything at the palace. You're going to be wasting all this good times and good stuff on a man who can't appreciate it. So, I'm going to bow out and I'm going to let you,
Mhm.
Or the second way to read it is this guy is a pretty savvy politician because he knows that aligning himself too closely and too publicly, too permanently with David might cause some issues with some of his other clients. And, in politely declining Dave to be David's political pawn, he's saying that he realizes the only one who benefits from this really is David. Barzillai is
Mhm.
wealthy and powerful in his own right. He doesn't need David supporting him. And the writer has deliberately framed Barzillai kind of as a second David figure in the story because he puts David's words in Barzillai's mouth. Because remember back when David had encountered Hushai, that's chapter 15:32, David had told Hushai, if you go with me, you will be a burden to me. So now Barzillai flips around David's argument and says, I don't want to be a Hushai. I don't want to be a burden to you. And so to me, I don't think Barzillai is this helpless old man who's, teetering on the edge of the grave. He reads like a great man. He reads like the politician who managed to gain his status because he was smart and he knew how to play the games of his day. And the thing is he doesn't just stop here. He actually continues in verse 36. He says, "Your servant will go a little way over the Jordan with the king. Why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant return, that I might die in my own city near the grave of my father and my mother. But here is your servant, PM. Let him go with my lord the king, and do for him whatever seems good to you." So first, Barzillai downplays his importance, and he suggests, basically, I'm dying soon, and don't waste it on me. But then he offers this alternative, Kiam. Now, the writer Samuel tells us absolutely nothing about this guy. We just get a name, and we aren't giving any hint as to why Barzillai would suggest that David take Kiam whenever he declines David's invitation. The few clues we do have come from other verses in the Bible. And so, first of all, in 1 Kings 2:7, David instructs Solomon that he's supposed to let the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, to eat at the king's table. And so we don't have a direct name there, but we have this reference to someone connected, a son connected to Barzillai eating at the king's table. And that is exactly what Barzillai had suggested, that Kiam take his place eating at the king's table. So we think that Kiam possibly was Barzillai's son. As
Okay.
Ezra 261, there's a priest who takes a wife from the sons of Barzillai and was called by their name. So Barzillai was so well respected that the man who married one of his daughters or granddaughters actually take Barzillai's name as a family name. So that's another hint not only to what happens with these guys or Barzillai's sons in the future, it's also a hint as to the greatness of Barzillai in his day, that if you marry one of his daughters, you take the father-in-law's name. That's pretty, um, that's telling that he's pretty important.
Sure.
That's not something that's done lightly.
Yeah, you don't change your name without some kind of commitment,
Well,
typically.
even today, I mean, how many men do you know who take their wife's name? I mean, it just, we still don't do that as standard practice, and typically when it does happen, there's a reason there that goes beyond just, "Oh, her name sounds better." So, you
Right.
know,
Right.
but Jeremiah 41:17 identifies a location, as it says, Gareth, Kayam, near Bethlehem. That's the name, but if the Hebrew there for Gareth is the hospitality of, or the hospitality accorded to Kiam. So we think that it's a piece of land that David set aside for Kiam to have, for to work and get some kind of return to support himself while he was staying with David. And so this is a really smart move on Barzillai's part, because there's a tradition in ancient cultures, and almost every ancient culture, where trading children is actually part of sealing covenants and compacts between the two families. If somebody's got my kid in their house, it's less likely I'm going to attack the house, is pretty much what it amounts to. And so by Go ahead.
I was gonna say I'm pretty glad that's not a practice anymore. I like my kids. I don't know. I don't know about like having someone else's kid in my house. It just
Wait till
seems
they're
kind of weird.
teenagers. No. Yeah,
Stop that. Just stop
I
it.
Okay, okay, okay. Yeah, but this is one of the ways that you formalize a covenant alliance between two families, and like I said, it's so effective that a lot of cultures did practice it, and so Barzillai is formalizing an alliance with David, but not too much. It's not sending his son to live with David. It's not the same as Barzillai going to live with David,
Right.
and so it's just enough to demonstrate, hey, there's not going to be hostilities, but not so much that Barzillai is becoming dependent on David. He's not placing himself at David's mercy.
Mhm.
So, verse 38, and the king answered, Kiam shall go over with me, and I will do for him what seems good to you, and all that you desire me, I will do for you. So David accepts Barzillai's offer, and he makes Barzillai a really extraordinary promise, because notice what he's promising to do. He will do for Kiam whatever Barzillai thinks is good for Kiam, not what David thinks is good. And
Right.
he says that he will do whatever Barzillai desires. So this is not just, hey, I'm going to control your son or control your family, or Barzillai even giving up his son and relinquishing all rights. David is saying, you're still going to have input here. You're going to have an impact on my decisions. That's crazy. There's not many people that a king makes himself beholden to. And, and the other thing too is Barzillai has set it up so that it's easy for David to make this promise. I mean, after all, what does it hurt to make this outrageous promise to a dying man? I mean, you only have to honor it for a few months if you take Barzillai's words at face value.
Right. Right.
So I think Barzillai is a little smarter than we give him credit for when we first read this. At first it seems like he's just, being all humble, but his words sound like David's. He's got
Mhm.
that same attitude, and you can see that politician's bent, that politician's kind of approach to things within this culture. And so I think it's really interesting that you see the two together. Verse 39, then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king went over, and the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him and returned to his own home. Now, Alter wrote this about this verse, and there just wasn't much improving on it, so I'm just going to read it. It says, this entire catastrophic sequence in the David story began with David's cold kiss to his son from whom he had been estranged, followed by Absalom's calculated kiss for every man he enlisted to his cause at the gate of the city. Now the king bestows a kiss of true affection upon a loyal old man who provided for him and his troops in the moment of need. But I don't think Alter took it far enough, because if you go back and you start looking at the various pieces of the stories together, you start to see something even larger. I mean, Absalom, we've got to remember when his story began, he enacted justice on the king's son whenever uh, Amnon had attacked Tamar. And it was after he had killed Amnon that he had fled from Jerusalem. Now, Barzillai and his son had helped enact justice on another one of the king's son, Absalom himself, and they escort the king into Jerusalem. So you have the enacting of justice on a king's son, and that reversal, fleeing from Jerusalem and returning to Jerusalem. Kiam is given an unconditional place at the king's table, where Absalom was not even allowed to be in the king's presence. He had to set Joab's fields on fire in order to get an audience with his own dad. And then when Absalom does see David, he gets that cold, politically correct, formal um, kiss from the king. He doesn't get the kiss of affection from the father who's welcoming back. And it was at that point that the story turned, and Absalom went from wanting to be a part of David's court to starting to plot against David and starting to be rebellious within the kingdom. And
Mhm.
Barzillai, he's kissed with acceptance and with true affection and support for what he's doing. And so we have um, this really interesting reversal here, where so much of what David did in the past leading up to his exile is getting replayed in a slightly different manner, so that we can see that David had a chance to grow. He had a chance to change. And, the things that God confronts him with directly through Nathan the prophet, where he says, hey, you're the man. And he explains that, all of this division is going to come from your house, within your house, and it's going to be upon your house. Then now David would repent of that. But when it comes to the day-to-day decisions, when it comes to being the politician, David can't figure out how to just be who he's supposed to be in that day-to-day setting. He lets the role define him instead of him defining the role. And
Mhm.
that's that's the sad part, because these are the decisions that ultimately lead to so many of the travesties that follow within David's rule, and even proceed into Solomon's rule, and then, of course, with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, which results in a divided kingdom. And that's why the rabbis can look back and say, this is where it happened. This is where David fell down, and this is the consequence of that action. So, um, verse 41, and then all the men of Israel came out to the king and said to the king, why have our brothers of the men of Judah stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan and all of David's men with him? So when it's saying here that all the men of Israel, this is everyone except for the tribe of Judah. And we already talked about how there's a schism starting to form between there. And David had singled them out previously in this chapter. Remember, he had sent the priest to go advocate on his behalf with Judah and said, why is Israel proclaiming me king? And you guys are wasting time, essentially. And now Israel, everyone else is getting mad. What do you mean? Why are you saying that he's your king? He's all of our king. So actually, they say, verse 42, and all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? So basically, Judah is saying, hey, look, we didn't gain anything from this. He's family. We're related by blood. This is the reason why we have a claim to him and you don't. So you need to back off, is pretty much what they're telling everyone. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king. Basically, you're one tribe, there's 10 of us. And notice there too, it's Judah and 10 tribes. Where's Benjamin at in this debate?
Right.
They are not being mentioned, but we already know that they've joined with Judah because Shimei had arrived with Ziva and 1,000 men from Benjamin. So Benjamin at this point they're starting to be considered very closely aligned with Judah. And that schism is slowly broadening, and it will continue to broaden until we get to the dividing kingdom. And Judah points out that, we weren't bought off. We didn't eat at the king's table. He didn't give us a gift. We have not been bribed. This is just a family member. So anyway, we have 10 shares in the king, and David also, we have more than you. Why then did you despise us? Were we not the first in bringing back our king? But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of Israel. So, this is kind of interesting because basically the tribe said, hey, we spoke up. Israel says, we spoke up first. Judah, you were being quiet. You relinquished your right to have this celebration, this honor, because you didn't speak up soon enough. David actually had to single you out and make you step up. But now the 10 tribes also presents another connection that was easy to lose. And I thought this was very interesting. The 10 tribes were actually, according to the rabbis, were supposed to represent the 10 concubines of David. And so the fact that there's 10 tribes who now are saying he's our king, we're going to get into that when we get into to the rebellion of Shiva, because we have some more connections. We can't forget that these women were a part of everything that has gone up to this, built up to this point. And, basically the writer seems to have forgotten about them. And the rabbis are trying to take us back and make that connection, because so much of the story, when you just read through it, if you aren't keeping track of where the women are and making that very conscious effort to see how the women are being treated, how they're responding, you forget that many times within the story of David, they are the catalyst. And that's good and bad, because, you go back to Michael, who saves David's life. You can go to Abigail, again, who saves David's life. Hannah, the one who prophesied of him, the coming Messiah, the back in 1 Samuel. But then you also have these 10 concubines and Bathsheba. And so and Tamar, his own daughter, the wise woman of Tekoa. Every major event has had something to do with women. And the rabbis pick up on this. And when they pick up on this, what they're doing is they find ways to reinsert the women into the story even when they aren't directly to mentioned. But so we got 10 tribes. We have this slight reference to remind us of the 10 concubines. And we see that basically Judah is louder. They are more fierce. So their words are more
Mhm.
fierce. This is the only reason why they win the argument. So we're already seeing that there's some level of intimidation where Judah is more powerful or could be seen more powerful than the 10 tribes were together,
Mhm.
which we've already seen that to some extent because when we go back to Judges and remember back with the Levite and the concubine, the armies were divided with the 10 tribes, or sorry, with 10 tribes in Judah, and at that point Judah was fighting against Benjamin. So now there, and we're going to go into chapter 20. We've got a few minutes here. We'll go ahead and fill them up. It says, now there happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Birkri, the Benjaminite, and he blew a trumpet and said, we have no portion in David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So things are not fine. And I think that's the big takeaway from everything that's going on. David is king of Israel, but it's not this idealized version that we have had in our mind since Sunday school.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it really is. It, they gloss over a lot of stuff in Sunday school, and there's and it's really interesting. I mean, going through this, I've been more interested in what's going on because we are getting a lot of detail, and partly probably also because I'm an adult. That probably helps. Um, but it's kind of the way that history's taught, and the way a lot of it goes in Sunday school is it's memorizing names, memorizing dates, it's like it's just all this stuff with no context. There's no humanity in what's happening in the course of the events, and this
Mhm.
is really bringing it back. I feel like you're doing a pretty good job of tying in those details and making it more interesting than just in this date the kingdom split because of this and this, and it that's what we got growing up. And I know a lot of it is just resources.
Mhm.
So I'm not trying to fault anyone who was teaching Sunday school, but that's probably how they were taught it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and there's not all these details. We didn't have people talking about the rabbinic interpretations and traditions and the way things were perceived. So or even Second Temple literature
Mhm.
or different things like that. So yeah, yeah,
Well,
there's just
it's
a lot more to it than just the names and dates. And then when we're not talking specifically about this run in or that run in, oh, everything was just fine and it was the perfect place to live.
well,
Was how
God
it was presented.
God said David was supposed to be king, so he was king, right? There was
Hmm.
no struggle, there was no dispute, there was no debate because God had said it. And, that's kind of how it was presented. And there was even this idea that, and there still is this idea that you don't question God. And so
Right.
by even thinking that there could be some division within the context and day of David, that's implying that maybe just because God says something, it might not be a done deal. And I think sometimes we
Well,
for
go ahead. Sorry,
I
finish
say
that.
sometimes we forget that when God decrees something, yes, it is settled. It's finished. It's not there's no debate that's going to happen, but there's still the process.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the process is often very messy because
Right.
we as human beings are messy creatures. I mean, if David had not sent servants to comfort Hanun, then there would have been no war with Rabbah. And if there hadn't been a war with Rabbah, there would have been no chance for him to see Bathsheba. If they hadn't seen Bathsheba, then there would have been no prophecy from Nathan. And if he hadn't slept with David, then if Amnon had raped Tamar, then David would have had the authority to speak up and do something about what was happening in his own house. And then he wouldn't have had the Absalom's rebellion. So you see how the process, even though, yes, David is king and he is the most celebrated king of all of Israel's history, the process was complicated because David kept misplacing his compassion.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
failed to uphold the ideal of who and what the Messiah should be. And that that's the thing. I think that's what we've got to come back to, where we've got to realize where when things don't work out, it's not because, oh, wait a minute, God's not there, God's not at work, and that, maybe we're failing to have some kind of level of faith for God to go ahead and do what he promised. That no, sometimes the process is just messy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there is this, I think there's a couple things going on there, and one of those is I think we tend to, when we look back on history, we tend to see every place, every country as a monoculture.
Mhm.
Everything is exactly the same. The Jews were all the same. They all said the same thing and thought the same thing, and everything was exactly the same, except for the times when it was recorded, it wasn't. And then those people were rooted out, so everyone could go back and agreeing and doing the exact same thing.
Which is
When we,
hilarious when you
oh,
look at we've come through judges to get here.
hmm hmm yeah, and I think that I don't know exactly. I mean, that's just it's part of the the, the flaws in the way we study history, but there's that, and then there's also this kind of this idea that goes on and in Christian circles that we have this saying that's God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And I think there is something to some of
Mhm,
that, but I think we tend to overplay that.
mhm,
And this we overlook the fact that during this time David was fighting battles. He was learning about the time he spent in Saul's palace. He was learning. It's this idea that people tend to think, we, and I think I don't know if I've said this before on the show, but we tend to take this idea of our doctrine of salvation, which there's nothing we can do to save ourselves. And too often we apply it to our calling and what God calls us to do. And we say, God's called me to this. And when it's time, whoever it is who's in, he's just going to tell the person who's in charge of putting me in that position that I'll just be in that position. And we don't work to build a resume. We don't work to improve skills. And we
and we
go,
wait for s we
or
wait
we
for s
go, go ahead. What?
or we wait for somebody to knock on our door and say, "Hey, I heard you were funny,"
Yeah, well, or we're in that position and we're like, "Oh, well, this is where God put me, so this is my calling, so I must be
Mhm,
doing it right."
right.
And then we wind up with a bunch of mediocre songwriters uh, pumping stuff out into the Christian music market. But anyway, that's or not getting any better at leading congregations as a worship leader or improving your presentation skills as a pastor. Um, those are things that we should be doing. If we are being paid to do those things professionally, we should be working on those things at a professional level, whether that's, and I say professionally, a lot of people think, oh, well, it's not professional. Well, it is professional. If it's what you're getting paid to do, uh, you know, you should be putting in some time and investment to give back to people uh, what they're putting into it. And yes, there is a there is a point where it's not all about professionalism and it's not all about your polish and shine on your presentation, but I think we should each be working to do those things to the best of our abilities and working to get better and looking at where we can improve. And I that sorry, I'm kind of on my soapbox about this a little bit, but it is that whole deal. I think that we want to try to go, God called the person and just put them in the position and they just or God did it all through them, which yes, but he also works providentially with people's skill sets and things of that nature.
Well,
So
I
go ahead.
I I have to throw this out there because when I was speaking with Ruth Whiteford, and she used this phrase that I love, and I told her I was totally gonna plagiarize her. She said, when we become Christians and we enter into this covenant relationship," something along those lines. She said, "We become friends with excellence." And I'm like,
Hmm.
I really like that. I mean, because if you're friends with excellence, then that changes how you do things. that
Mhm.
changes how you approach what you're doing. And I think as Christians, as representatives of God here on earth, we need to be doing things with excellence because we represent a God of excellence. And so whenever we get lazy and we stop taking responsibility to improve our skill set or to do things to the best of our ability, then are we really being excellence friend? Or are we becoming, in fact, an enemy and presenting God poorly to the world? And so, I think that's one of the things that we see with David, and to bring it back to our story, in those moments where he is wholly dependent on God, when he's running for his life, when he's facing the giants, when he's, you know, in the middle of a crisis and he realizes that he needs God's help, this is the David we love and celebrate. This is the David we want to be like. The moment he starts thinking, I'm king and things go my way because I'm king and I deserve this because I'm king, this is when he does all the stupid stuff that
Mhm.
causes problems, not just in his own life, but the lives of his children and the lives of the kingdom. And ultimately, if you want to get really technical and follow the line out as far as we can, even impacts our lives today
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
we don't see the proper we don't have a proper view of David. We've gotten this imbalanced perception of him. And and we want to talk about one of the big arguments about taking the Bible seriously and honoring the Bible is, well, David was a man after God's own heart and he raped Bathsheba. And a lot of people are done with the Bible right there.
Mhm.
So David's actions still have consequences, and I think we need to take that as a point of learning in our own lives that our actions have consequences beyond ourselves. Why? Because we're eternal and we serve a God who's eternal. So we need to be paying attention and trying to do things well in order to make sure the consequences of our actions are something that we want to live in and that we want our children to live in and our grandchildren. Because David forgot that. Why? Because he had misplaced compassion. And I'm not want to get too political here, but that's one of the things that as we've studied in our own culture, me looking around going, how many times in the Christian culture is our compassion misplaced and
Mhm.
misapplied? And what are the consequences going to be for that?
Yeah,
And that
that's we're
scares me.
seeing a lot of the fallout of that,
Mhm.
and so
On that
this,
sad note,
yeah, that's a whole nother podcast. That's not even another episode. I think that's a do a whole season on that. But that being said, everyone, thanks for joining us. Hopefully, we'll end on a happier note next time. Um, that being said, if you want to be part of the conversation, maybe cheer everyone up. Join us over at Raven Creek SC on all the social media. RavenCreekSC.com is the website, gets you to our show with show notes and also other shows. We've got about 5 right now, and we may or may not have some things on the hopper that we'll
Mhm.
announce within the next few months. I'm excited about those things, and hopefully you are too, and we'll let you know when we can. Um, so in the meantime, we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.